Everyone was kung fu fighting. Well, everyone except Nintendo. As we move to wrap up Game Boy Works 1990. December 1990 was a traffic jam of releases for Game Boy, with 40 titles alone shipping in Japan. Some of those games were very, very good, like Final Fantasy Legend II, while others were the sort of thing you could take or leave. Irem's Kung Fu Master definitely qualifies as the latter. Ostensibly a conversion of Kung Fu for NES to Game Boy, in practice it plays as more of a sequel that unfortunately feels somehow more shallow than the original. Kung Fu, of course, had been one of 2 third-party creations Nintendo published in the US at the NES launch, and from a technical perspective, it handily outshone anything else in those early months that wasn't called Super Mario Bros. It was the kind of game that shop owners could leave running on demo play in their display kiosk and set the hearts of every child within viewing range alight with covetousness. Kung Fu Master on Game Boy does not have that same impact. It's fine, with decent graphics and sound, but it's the kind of game you can complete in less than 10 minutes once you get the hang of its quirks. Although its title doesn't match that of the NES release, Kung Fu Master was actually Irem's preferred name for the original arcade game and its ports outside Japan. It was the title worn by most 8-bit conversions of the coin app that weren't published by Nintendo. In Japan, this release was called simply Spartan X, the same as the arcade and NES game, having been based loosely on the same exact Jackie Chan film. Heck, the protagonist's sprite even underwent a minor facelift in localization, losing his shaggy mullet in order to make him look less like a tiny pixel Jackie Chan. But despite sporting the same title, protagonist, and media license as the NES game, Kung Fu Master does not simply convert the content and mechanics of that classic into monochrome. If anything, it plays more like Kung Fu's spiritual successor Vigilante, with its more detailed visuals and seemingly post-apocalyptic backgrounds. The final showdown with Mr. X takes place against a desolate backdrop. It feels more like Fist of the North Star than anything else. On a fundamental level, Kung Fu Master still sees players walking forward relentlessly while punching and kicking droves of enemies to drive them back. Some walk mindlessly forward, while others hover out of reach while trying to harass you with longer range weapons that give them an advantage over your melee skills. You can jump and duck and attack while performing either maneuver. New to this version is the need to jump, as the totally ground-based design of the older game has undergone a bit of a shakeup in order to incorporate platforms and moving elevators in the later stages, which no longer appear to take place in a martial arts dojo, but rather in the Technodrome from Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. Later stages also throw in the leaping, pint-sized martial artists who were so memorable in the original game, as well as a host of ninja who appear from above and fling triple-shot spreads of shuriken at you. There are also guys with guns. Guns! The ninja and gunners feel wildly out of place in this game, presenting a threat level far beyond what protagonist Bruce Leap, can reasonably handle with his melee skills. Though thankfully he does share Takemaru's ability to deflect throwing stars with his short-range attacks. Not so much bullets though. While Kung Fu Master on Game Boy definitely elevates the intensity of the action with a more varied, dynamic sandbox over previous versions, especially on hard mode, it does at least provide players with a few helpful boosts to balance things out. When you defeat enemies, they may drop health refills or even bombs that you can use to attack your foes with. The bombs feel almost essential for taking on the bosses, who tend to wildly overmatch Bruce Leap. They have a greater range, mobility, and power than our hero, and they can easily corner you and sap your health in a hurry. The first boss has a huge chainsaw that it flails around, while the second chucks barrels. The third boss is a huge hurdle, blasting you with a flamethrower while gouts of fire burst up into the air on either side of you. And the fifth guy, a sword wielder on a conveyor belt, is ridiculous. In fairness, the bosses do have exploitable weaknesses, and most of them can be forced into loops that leave them helpless or even stun-locked if you know the right timing. I guess what I'm saying is that this isn't a great game. Really, Kung Fu Master fits awkwardly into the Spartan X legacy. It falls somewhere between Vigilante for arcades and Spartan X2 for Famicom, and it isn't as good or interesting as either. Not quite a remake, not quite a sequel, it's just kind of there, offering a Hobbesian approach to game design, short, nasty, and brutish. As for who actually created it, well, although the game has a credit roll, all the games are pseudonymous and don't appear to line up with any other known credits. The Game Developer Research Institute posits that Biox had some role in development, which, considering their next effort would be the much despised Mega Man 2 for Game Boy, could explain some things. Then again, the music is credited to Irem's sound team, so it could just be that Irem did most of this work themselves, but simply didn't have a good handle on the hardware yet. At the very least, we know Irem published the game, even though Nintendo had published the original NES Kung Fu in all regions. As it turns out, Nintendo developed that version too, much to the dismay of Irem's internal teams, who had intended to make Kung Fu their big, splashy debut on Famicom. Well, here they finally had their chance to make their own version of Kung Fu for a Nintendo system. It's a bit unkind to say, but maybe they shouldn't have. Next up, we have another Game Boy RPG. This one, Winkysoft's Kininkou Maroku ONI, shipped a week ahead of Final Fantasy Legend in Japan, despite my kind of going out of sequence with these videos. That's good news for Oni, because it means it got to enjoy a week at retail before being absolutely eclipsed by a vastly superior work. Now, that doesn't mean Oni is bad by any means. It's a perfectly competent game, and honestly plays quite a bit better than you might expect from a portable role-playing game of this vintage. However, it's terribly simple, with a combat party consisting of a single character. Tenchi Maru, or whatever you name him, a young warrior from a hidden ninja village, and also the Oni referred to in the title. Not unlike Nazo no Murasame-jo, Oni goes pretty hard on classical Japanese imagery, which probably explains why it never saw an official US release. The version seen here is the excellent 2015 fan translation by Aishasha and Stardust Crusaders, available at romhacking.net. Nothing about Oni will surprise anyone who has any particular familiarity with anime, manga, and Japanese RPG tropes. Even in December 1990, this must have felt like video game comfort food. Your ninja-in-training protagonist is a bit of an underachiever and a slug-a-bed, and he's only thrust into the role of a hero by circumstance. An enemy ninja pilfers an important message Tenchi Maru is meant to deliver to another village the very first time he sets foot outside his home. And once you return to the village, you find it razed to the ground, and everyone Tenchi Maru has ever known slaughtered. Well, everyone except the innkeeper and item shop proprietor, that is. This sets Tenchi Maru on a quest for vengeance, I guess? He's a silent protagonist, so his motives are never really explained. Nevertheless, he ventures forth from village to village, fighting ninja and yōkai, mostly yōkai, along the way. These battles transpire as one-on-one encounters with various monsters, which take place in a sort of zoomed-in view. This is probably the niftiest trick in Oni's bag. Rather than unfolding as tiny, super-deformed sprites duking it out, Oni's battles depict both Tenchi Maru and his enemies as large, semi-animated characters more akin to sprites you'd see in the better flavor of action platformer. Combined with the quick, seamless transitions into battle and the no-fat combat format, Oni maintains a much livelier pace than most other RPGs of the era. There's not a whole lot of strategy to the combat, even after you start to learn spells and acquire consumable items, but everything plays out a lot faster than in other one-on-one combat RPGs of the era. Think the original Dragon Quest. It's also fairly forgiving in design. You naturally spend a majority of playtime here simply grinding for better stats, and even the cash to purchase newer, stronger equipment, but you learn healing magic early on, and even get your health and spirit power topped off every time you level up. A godsend while exploring the game's numerous, sprawling dungeons. The other notable element of Oni is the feature alluded to in the title. Midway through the adventure, Tenchi Maru gains the ability to transform into an Oni. That's another traditional Japanese monster of folklore, a demon/ogre, typically rendered with horns and a tendency to garb itself in tiger skins. Think Lum, but less cute. While that's not 100% the look our hero goes for here, the premise comes through. The Oni transformation serves two purposes. First, it gives Tenchi Maru access to a handful of unique combat skills that can only be used while in his alternate form. Secondly, it allows you to perform special story-specific tasks. Only an Oni can enter certain dungeons and towns, and only an Oni can see hidden secrets on the world map. The Oni form has some disadvantages. For starters, it can't wield swords the way Tenchi Maru's human form can, putting it at a disadvantage during combat. Though altering forms is a free action in combat, so it's pretty painless to switch back to your normal appearance. Secondly, Tenchi Maru's Oni-specific skills use a special pool of mana called Alter, which you need to keep topped off separately from standard skill points. This means that even using Oni Vision to look for secrets has a fairly significant cost, and you can only use this ability a limited number of times before heading to an inn to recharge. As portable RPGs go, Kininkou Maroku ONI lacks the ambition and scope of Final Fantasy Legend II, but then so do most portable RPGs. Taken on its own merits, Kininkou Maroku ONI does a pretty good job of taking a lot of fairly standard concepts and combining them into a breezy, low-fiction adventure with a somewhat unusual setting and a few notable play mechanics. It evidently did reasonably well for itself, as publisher Banpresto would go on to commission no less than 4 Game Boy sequels, as well as a couple of Super Famicom games and even a PlayStation prequel. All of these were headed up by producer Takeo Iijima, who clearly saw Oni as a passion project. He even worked with Compile Heart for a Nintendo DS installment of the series, and has seemingly vowed to revive the series somewhere down the road. The Oni franchise would grow in complexity and scale over the years, with the third entry gaining a proper party system and becoming more of a standard take on the genre. For the moment though, only the first game has a proper English fan translation. Hopefully, that will change by the time Game Boy Works makes it to the sequels. Next time on Game Boy Works, puzzles and platforming together on my Game Boy? It's more likely than you think.